Good afternoon. Welcome to the July 23rd Public Works and Finance Committee meeting. We're starting at 4 o'clock today. First item on our agenda is the approval of Public Works Finance Committee June 11th, 2018 minutes.
I would move to approve them as presented.
They look good to me too.
And they were fine with me. And so those are approved. And then the second item is approval of Public Works and Finance Committee July 9th, 2018 minutes.
Same thing.
They were good. Yep, felt like they were fine too. Item 3, FY 2019 proposed fee resolution.
Yes, good afternoon. We have in your packet the proposed fee resolution for fiscal year 2019. This fee resolution is designed and presented at this time to accompany the proposed budget that you'll be having the public hearing on August 6th. At the same time, we'll have a fee resolution hearing to present these and let the public have a moment to talk about it as well. I just wanted to highlight some of the items that have changed or primarily have increased in the fees over 2018. And if with the fee resolution, I have page numbers here if you want me to stop and call those out as we go. There's only about 5 or 6 areas that are really notable at this point. Other areas either didn't have any change, and in some instances it was just a few pennies of a change. So I'll mention the big ones here. First, just on that's packet page 13 of the fee resolution, the land use and development fees. Permit fees, building electrical, mechanical, and building fees were all raised. This is part of a 3-year plan. This is year 2 of 3 to raise those fees to more accurately reflect the actual cost of services for those. So those are have some noteworthy fees in there. They're not fees that are regularly applied for by one person. For instance, it's not something someone would come in for time and time again unless they're a developer of something of the sort. But for the most part, those are in year 2 of a 3-year phase in. So you'll see another increase in those next year as they catch up to where the actual cost of service is for those. Next up would be the new grading permit security deposit. This is a new fee, and that's on packet page 19. That is designed to accommodate the security deposit needed for new grading permits. It's a service that we've seen more and more over the years, and have put that deposit fee into place for that. And then sanitation and solid waste fees, as well as utility rates. So this would be page 23 of the packet.
This is 23 of 31, right?
I don't know. I just have packet page 19. I don't have the ofs on my printout. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it's 23. Packet page 23, it says in the bottom right-hand corner.
Okay.
So these are the typical, you've seen these in the proposed budget process in the workshop. These are fee increases for utility rates per the sanitation rate study, the water utility rate study, and the sewer rate studies of about 6.3% for the utilities as those move forward. You'll also see, and this is specific to packet page 23, that new small commercial rate that was discussed just about a month ago regarding commercial rates for small businesses looking to irrigate small lawns. That new rate has also been included in the proposed fee resolution for next year. Those are pretty simple and routine for the utility rates. The parks and recreation fees, those are specific to program changes. If there are different programs or new programs, you would see obviously a new fee to go with those. One thing we will note is throughout primarily the pool admission and the HERC and EGAN staffing, we've seen higher competition when it comes to retaining part-time people, especially with Washington going to a higher minimum wage. So there has been an increase in fees to help us accommodate a little bit more in salary for those part-time people. So those are the bulk of the fee increases there. Let's see here. Oh, and then backing up just a bit, the street security deposit fee for right-of-way excavation. That more accurately reflects the actual cost of the fee. That's on packet page 27. Fiber optic service licensing fees is one of the items we talk about each year. That actually starts on January 1, not on October 1 with the rest of the fees. And that's very minor. It's just several cents there, but it does have a little bit of a different timeline. And then I also wanted to mention the farmers market fees, which have not been proposed for any changes in this fee resolution. We really wanted to have an entire season of the fee structure that was adopted last winter to be able to evaluate that before we made proposals on changes to fees for that particular entity moving forward. So we've maintained that as is, and we'll be visiting that over the winter to see if there should be some adjustments. And when I say we, I'm sorry, the Farmers Market Commission will be looking at that for potential adjustments.
How has the three-tier situation worked out so far? Pretty smoothly?
It's
or-
worked really well. We also took on or went with a different vendor for processing our vendor signups and payment processes, which has been outstanding. We've been able to do a lot of online payment. So even outside of the fee resolution, that was a great efficiency that from the operations side we were able to realize. So there's been a little bit of confusion. I think there's just still a lot of options available to a vendor. So trying to pick and choose just where they fit. Staff's just been willing to work through that with people and get them to the right place. So I think it's worked very well. Our revenue stayed fairly steady, which is what we anticipated with kind of that leveling of some people paying more, some people paying less. Now it's more of an average. So it's working the way I think we intended. Just getting through that implementation of what tier am I and how many days do I want to do and some of those kinds of things. We've just worked through that vendor by vendor, and a lot of folks have seemed to be okay with it, and we'll continue to work forward.
Thank you.
With that, that's the bulk of the fee changes for the coming year. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer those.
And so if I was a regular citizen and I'm looking for this and I go to the city website, what's the best way to find it?
If you go under the residents tab at the top, we've got government services residents, go under residents, and it says budgets, audits, and fee resolutions.
Okay.
And so our current proposed budget documents are there with the summary and the detailed version. You've got both versions there. And then the fee resolution is there as well with an explanation of what each of these things is. So that audit piece you won't see until the end of this year, I believe. So really right now we're in budget and fee resolution mode, but all three of those items that make up our financial calendar are there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, knowing all that information, we just have to review it, so there's no other further action, and this is gonna move on to the council
And this will be on regular agenda as a public hearing.
next, August 6th.
August 6th.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then item 4 is Trindera Engineering Master Agreement for Professional Services. Hi.
I'm David Richardson, Utility Special Projects Manager. This is for a master agreement for Trindera, which is an electrical engineering firm. We presently have an agreement with another firm that was bought out by a large manufacturing company, and they're not going to be doing any more work other than for the new owner. So we need to have an additional engineering firm, electrical engineering firm, so that we can get get projects done.
Okay, and here it says too that you're just, so that you can be contracted through a task order agreement?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that you're just be part of that process?
Right.
Okay. Is there anything else you wanted to say? Do you have any questions or anything? We've gotten pretty good, lately it seems like of the task order agreement's been coming forward, so it looks like then we would just recommend for council approval for master services agreement for professional services. Yeah?
Just for on-call.
Is that good with y'all?
I'm
And-
good with it. That's-
And then onto consent agenda? Yeah. Right. Thank you. Item 5, Spin Dockless Bike Share Program. Hello?
Good afternoon.
Noon.
Well, about 2 weeks ago, we sat here and discussed the concept of bike share systems within the city of Moscow. And I spent a little time kind of walking through some of the history and the different types of systems, some of the providers that are out there, common features among them, and the unique aspects of a dockless system. Also talked a little bit about the University of Idaho's upcoming program to launch a spin bike share, dockless bike share program yet this summer, so next month. And Becky Couch is here from U of I Parking and Transportation Services as well, if we have questions for her. But today, the next step, if you will, based on the interest that was shown here a couple of weeks ago, is to bring back a proposed memorandum of understanding, which is what is in your packet, that would expand, in essence, the university's program to a citywide program. So it would be an agreement that the city would have with the provider, spin provider, and then the university has their own agreement, but they would be running concurrently, and then in effect having a seamless citywide bike share program in place starting next month. So the packet has a copy of the draft MOU. It also has a memo that I prepared last week for Gary that kind of outlines some of the I guess, highlights of the MOU and the types of things that are often asked about in these programs when they're being implemented. Certainly the issues of, what's allowed, where can people ride, where do you put, and what happens to the bikes when people park them, and who do you call, those kind of things are pretty typical that you run into in these programs, and every city has to deal with that. There's always a bit of an education component that the spin would need to provide to their users about where you can park and end rides and those types of things. Within the MOU, there are provisions pertaining to the availability of spin staff, local staff, to come out and pick up bikes or other devices that are in the program within a reasonable amount of time to get them out of the way if there's a problem with where they are deposited by the users. There are provisions in here that essentially provide a license to spin to use the right-of-way for this service. One of the things that comes up in this discussion, of course, is they are providing a service and selling a product within public right-of-way, and so we license that through our vendor licensing, that type of thing. So in essence, we're providing them that license as part of this MOU so that they have permission to act as a vendor within the right-of-way and elsewhere within the city. To start out, the program would launch with, I believe it's 100 standard bicycles that would come into town next month, and then Spin would like to add to that 50 to 75 electric scooters after the first of the year. The MOU allows them to start with the bikes, but then requires further approval from the city before they could bring in the electric scooters essentially off campus. And that would allow us some time to finish sorting out some questions that go with those. There are questions pertaining to how are electric scooters seen when it comes to statutes and state law and traffic management, and are they allowed on a street versus a sidewalk? And they're just kind of an oddball creature out there right now, and different states are dealing with them in different ways, but a lot of that's happening right now. And there are a good dozen states out there that now have identified scooters specifically and given them a title and started putting together some statutes as to how they can be used in the public thoroughfares. So that's something that we'll need a little bit more time to look at. So the agreement's set up to accommodate that, assuming we come to some answers that are acceptable for the city prior to that January timeframe.
What about the e-bikes? We talked about those too. Do they get the same designation as the scooters?
Well, they are a bicycle.
They still say it's
They
bicycle.
are an electric assist, but the program as it's laid out right now would not include the e-bikes. That would be a future addition, and again, require approval from the city off of campus. As far as I know, and Becky can confirm this, but I don't believe there's a desire to include the e-bikes in this first-year pilot program. It was just the regular bikes and the scooters, and then see what the demand is, how the program works before they assess the addition of e-bikes, the electric bike.
Well, I would like to ask Becky to come on up, because I think what you mentioned something, Les, that I think that we wanted to talk about as we're understanding what works for the city with the licensing and severability if it's not working. So I kind of wanted you to go into, we know what we want it to look like, but what happens if it doesn't look like that so far, and then where do we go? Kind of give us some,
Sure. Yeah, I can
with the
speak to.
university, and then, Les can speak for the city.
Yeah, so within our agreement, it's just within 30 days. Either party can just provide notice that they're not happy, and Spin has all responsibility for removing all of the bikes. So it's pretty.
That is the same language that we have in the city's MOU.
What do you think's going to be something that you wouldn't be happy with?
Good question. I keep telling people we will have issues with parking and maybe people messing around with the bikes, placing them in oddball locations, not actually users, just someone walking by and wanting to mess with a bike.
Yeah.
We will see those issues, I believe. They're seeing them in other communities, but we'll deal with them. But say, I don't know, Spin has been so good to work with so far, but say they don't respond to those issues or
Yeah.
don't want to work with us, or they try to bring in scooters without our approval or something, to do something way off, without working with us. That's something I could see, but
I could also see if for some reason the vehicles themselves, the bikes themselves are not functioning well.
Yeah.
And perhaps they're not addressing that. And so that we start seeing broken bikes that are not taken care of. I mean, I doubt that would happen here, but that's the kind of thing I think would also get our attention.
So when someone has problems with a bike, they'll contact Spin.
Yeah, Spin takes care of everything in this case. The city and the university set parameters as to how we want the systems to operate and how we'd like to see parking occur. Obviously, that really is to some extent the whim of the user. And then Spin has to address how that user leaves those bikes or scooters. But yeah, overall, Spin, they provide all the equipment, they provide the application, they do the maintenance, they do the redistribution of things, they address problems that may arise, they deal with all of that. And so the city and the university really are just granting permission for the use of our respective areas so that they can operate.
And so when the spring comes and they've said they want to do the e-scooters, do you think the university's going to be okay with them on sidewalks? Can you tell kind of what you all are thinking now?
I'm not sure. I really look
Yeah.
forward to just working with the
To
city
see.
and going
Yeah.
with what the city wants to do, because if
Okay.
they're going to be ridden on and off campus, it should be the same rules to follow as far
Okay.
as where you ride. And we do have our campus walkway, which is a bit different, so we can have different rules for that. But as far as whether they ride on the sidewalk or the street or the bike lane, that should be consistent citywide,
Oh, okay.
I think. And then just to add one other thing, I think to be successful, we need to be good partners. Although they're responsible for taking care of all the issues and things, but we need to be good partners in notifying them of everything, and helping with communications and promoting and things like that. So we'll be doing a lot of that on campus. So
Yeah, and maybe do they normally, after something's been put in place, do they do some sort of follow-up focus groups, or 2 months in they get together with the entities and the people that have used it and kind of a like a debrief?
I haven't heard of
on so-
anything formal
No.
that they'll do as far as within 1 month we'll do this, but I'm sure they'll be checking in regularly.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you saying like maybe they take a little time to see where the bikes end up. As far as when you mentioned the redistribution, does that just take a little time to see if they all end up in one part of time in town? They take a look at that and then plan
Yep.
to move them?
I believe so, yeah. The GPS, tells them where the bikes are being
Right,
used
so
and
they
where
can
they're
track it from anywhere,
landing.
yeah.
And
Okay. And then in the MOU, it talks about that you could park on private property with discretion of the property owner. So if you did that and had the approval of the property owner, can someone else then see there's a bike on this property and go and get it?
That's an interesting question. And, again, what we oversee is the management of the city's area of authority, which in this case would be the street thoroughfares and the right-of-way. We put that language in there in that there are some areas where we may not want to see, bikes perhaps on the city street or something like that. Or users are looking to go, for instance, to the mall. Now, that's not public right-of-way, that's actually university ground which has a lease upon it for the mall operations. I'm sure there will be people that will want to ride to the mall and park and
Oh, yeah.
go shop. So is the leaseholder okay with that? And so that's a decision that they would need to make, whether or not they're going to allow that to occur. I would suspect they would, just like you can drive your car and
Right.
park in the parking lot. But not every property owner is going to want to see that. So that's something that they will have to work out on individual properties with, Spin if people are parking there. And maybe the property owner is not interested in that. And that's something that I'm sure will come up in the discussions. And maybe it's an area that becomes geo-fenced out. And so they cannot end a ride there.
So in that case, they would be agreeing to bikes being left there and being picked up there.
in essence.
But if you read this like private property, like my front yard or something, and I said to a friend, sure, you can leave it here while you go, but then someone else, the way it's written, can they come into like my private property and go sign the bike out?
Well, I don't-
Because I guess I could foresee you wouldn't want people then just saving their bikes by putting them in somebody's yard.
Somebody's yard.
And not
You could
having
put
to
a
pay
hold
for
on.
them.
You could
Right,
put a
but
hold
you have to
on
pay
it.
for that.
Well, true, but it's minimal. I mean,
Right.
if you want that bike to be there when you come out of a business or come out
Yeah.
of somebody's house, you can put it, for a small fee, you can put a hold on
Could put
it.
a hold on it.
I don't know, just
This,
maybe
the
something to think
MOU
of.
does not grant anybody the right to enter private property.
Okay.
So it does not address, private property rights. And so that's a question that I guess remains to be seen, how it would operate and how property owners feel about it.
Okay. And then one other thing that was cool, how they would be required to respond within an hour if someone complains about the location of a bike during these business hours. Could anybody call them? I mean,
Yes.
just, so, okay,
Yeah, there's a number
That's-
on the bike
okay.
that people can call.
Yeah, and we looked at a number of different MOUs that they had implemented throughout the country, of course, the universities as well, and we actually tightened that up just a little bit as compared to some of the others so that we could be sure that there would be responsiveness from SPIN. So it's at 6 a.m. to 9 p.m., if I remember correctly, each day. Somebody can be there within an hour. And if a call comes in after 9 p.m., sometime over the night, then that next morning, it would be addressed by 7 a.m. So it's an hour after they start their 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. timeframe. Really, the intent there was to be able to ensure that issues are addressed quickly so that it doesn't spin out of control. Shouldn't have said that. And such that, the system starts to have problems and we get pushback from the community about, hey, these bikes are all dumped here, nobody will come take care of them.
Yeah.
We don't want to run into that situation. So that was intended to keep that fairly tight and maintain responsiveness.
Well, and with all the research that you both have done in the cities that have the MOUs and the issues that happen with bikes, they have put in place, I think, stop gaps because they know where bikes get left. They know kind of rider behavior and patterns. They know what they're looking for and where they expect bikes to be and to go and stuff. So I think it'll be interesting to see how it tracks here compared to the cities that they've been in. And then in the winter, are they retracting any size, or they're just going to leave them?
I'm sure we'll talk more detail when we get
Yeah.
closer, but the initial talk was we want to leave them some, at least, to
Some,
be
yeah.
available for those and for those days where the sun comes out and there's no snow and ice on the street.
Yeah, and
So,
you can make
but I expect that we'll pull some in just because demand will decrease. So,
Okay. Well, this is good.
The electric scooter design that they're going to bring in here would be all Schedule 1 power with, like, Boise has on their trails. You can only use Schedule 1 e-bikes. The maximum speed is 18 miles an hour or something like that. Are those in that? They would be in that.
they're in that mile per hour range. I know that.
Yeah.
I don't know what schedule.
And I think most of them have on the sidewalk, if you're on the sidewalk, you can only go the speed of, walking speed, just like bicycles. If you're on the sidewalk, you can only go 3 miles an hour, and when you're on the street, you're a vehicle. And you're subject to the same rules of the road. You can't dart around and,
Yeah, that is the question. And the scooters are not addressed in state statute. They're not defined as a vehicle. And so that's where we have some research to do with respect to how they are seen in terms of being on the public street. And I don't know that there is a governor on the GPS on the sidewalk system, so it's just more a question of are people following the rule rather than a mechanical constraint or governor.
Okay. So our action is to then convey more information to the city council for consideration. Is there anything else specifically you'd like to make sure that we know that gets passed along?
Yeah, the action, I believe, was to, no, it was modified a little bit. Okay.
What did you
I'd
think it was?
anticipated that if the committee was comfortable with advancing it to the council for consideration of approval of the MOU, and if there was additional information that would be helpful in that process, then we can provide that as well.
Well, is it okay to ask Mia about this? Because I thought too that at this point, or Jen, Yeah.
You can certainly, if you've reviewed the MOU and want to forward it to council with a recommendation for approval, that would be fine, or if there's further discussion. It sounds like perhaps maybe the regular agenda is
Would be
where
the
you'd
place
like
for
this
it,
to be.
yeah.
I believe so, yeah. And the intent here was to convey whatever information and the MOU for consideration. So the idea
Yeah.
was to have the council consider the MOU as to whether or not they would like to.
I just wondered if there's anything else particular that you felt like needed to be.
I don't think so at this
No.
point. To us, most of the questions are revolving around the scooters. And because this essentially just allows the bikes at this point, it's a fairly straightforward MOU.
Okay, good. Well, I think definitely on regular agenda. Did you have a question?
And how will the boundaries, is the boundary going to be city limits? Is that decided?
Yeah, we haven't pinned that down for sure, but that's, I think, been the assumption that, we have no authority outside of city limits, so the operating boundary, at most, could be the city limit. And then we'll have to define whether there's any areas within that boundary that we want to have geofenced out for termination of rides. But that's something that can be adjusted as we go along.
So you could look into, like, I'm thinking about the two paths, that go outside.
Oh, you
all the
can
way-
ride anywhere.
Okay, you just
It's just you
couldn't
can't
leave it.
terminate.
You can't park it
You can't terminate
outside,
your
right.
rental
Yeah.
outside of that boundary.
So it doesn't get lost.
And Pullman has their own bike share program?
WSU does.
Okay.
Pullman does not. And so there's been at least some very preliminary discussions about the idea of
Yeah.
expansion of a system, and Spin's not ready to go there yet, I don't believe, and I don't know that Pullman is quite yet, but I think that has potential.
Yeah. Anything
I
else?
think it's best possible scenario, an independent business is coming in with no city
Yeah.
subsidy other than inviting them to come here. So that's,
Yeah.
what could be better to try this out?
Yeah,
Move
all
it
good.
ahead.
All right, thank you once again.
Thank you.
And see you at council. Yeah, thank you. And then go ahead, Les, you get to report on Third Street pedestrian bridge schedule.
Yeah, this, obviously, as you recall, in last week's city council meeting, we had a couple of motions that came through from the council. The first was to reject the bids for the vehicular multimodal bridge, which came in certainly higher than what we'd all anticipated. The first motion after that was to then pursue a temporary installation of a pedestrian bicycle bridge in lieu of the multimodal, and to have that bridge essentially acquired this fiscal year and installed by the end of the calendar year, paraphrasing slightly. The second motion was then to proceed with the rebidding of the multimodal bridge. Okay. So today, I just wanted to brief you a little bit on what we've been working on in the week since. Part of that process has been sorting out a little more on the costs and how they may affect our ability to acquire directly versus through a bid process. And so we've been working on that. We do not have all of the quotes back yet that we were hoping to have for this meeting, but the initial indications are for the size of bridge that we're probably going to be above that 50,000 threshold, which means we'd have to go out at least to a quote informal bid process. It's not a process that's very long, and we've worked it into the schedule, so I think it's very achievable to at least have something ordered and in the process of shop drawings and ultimately fabrication by September. Okay, or the end of September, I should say. So it wouldn't, we wouldn't actually make payment, if you will, until a little bit later, most likely, but at least it would be in the works and on its way. Okay. The schedule, we've also taken a look at, and I believe I don't think it was actually in your packet, but we have a preliminary schedule that we've put together that you may have seen from Gary
sent out
earlier.
a letter that had.
That kind of lays out what our experience has told us with respect to the timeline it takes to construct a pedestrian bridge of this nature. This is drawing heavily from our experience on the College Street installation, which is a very similar type of pedestrian bridge installation. So the timeline here essentially from start to finish is roughly 22 weeks. That takes into account things like dealing with the hydraulic analysis, the environmental aspects, permitting, the geotechnical review of the soil conditions to see what kind of footings work, those types of things. All that has to happen on a structure of this type. Then going out through the RFP process for the bids for the actual bridge, manufacture and delivery, the design of the approaches, because that would also need to happen, and then continue on through an installation process with bridge delivery, site prep, because we have to do foundation work, the actual foundations, delivery of the bridge, placement of the bridge, construction of the approaches, then construction of the deck. All of those types of things are generally included here. This schedule would anticipate a final completion sometime around the middle of January, which is pretty close to the end of the year target date. Obviously, the issue that could pop up for us is weather. And we are a bit concerned that when we're trying to do concrete pours in late November, December, bridge installation in January and completion in December, and then any kind of approach work, that would be asphalt surfacing or concrete surfacing. That is not an ideal time of year to be doing that. And so that does make it a bit challenging. If all things were perfect, then yes, I think this would work. We're just a bit at the mercy of the weather conditions. If we get a heavy snow starting out in mid-December or something like that, as we've seen in recent years, suddenly the street crew that would be installing the bridge is tied up plowing streets. So that just creates some concern for us in being able to meet the aggressive schedule. So with that, I guess I would ask if there's potential consideration of making some adjustments, if the council would consider that when we get to the next council meeting, perhaps on that schedule and the purchase dates. And if we could look at it from perspective of proceed, obviously, with the project, but perhaps have an end date of sometime in the spring in case we encounter weather issues or delivery issues, those types of things, that we can do the installation and then the final approaches when the weather is better.
So I have a question, because so we did all the hydraulic and geotechnical for the multimodal, right?
That is correct.
Can you use those?
Some of that information you can use, but it's a different structure, different load, different size footprint on the foundation, so it has to be reassessed in that regard. The hydraulic analysis will be fairly simple in that we already have the channel data, we know what the 100-year flood elevation is and all of that. So it's really just looking at, making sure that we have enough freeboard between that 100-year and the bottom truss or the chord of the bridge itself. And then that dictates how high the bridge has to be and where you can set the deck, and then how high above the surrounding grade the approaches may be, and the approach design, those types of things.
Yeah, and I liked in the letter, too, that was sent, was talking about we've got to make sure that it can be plowed, so it's going to need to be able to...
We've anticipated that we want a width that's sufficient and a structural capacity that's sufficient so that our small plows, the toolcat that Parks operates, can plow that as part of the path plowing operations that they do.
Yeah, I like that got put in there. That helps people think about it. It's an all-year type of bridge.
That's the idea. I mean, if we're plowing the two-way bike lane system, we might as well plow the bridge too. So.
Yeah.
When is the two-way bike system projected to be completed?
Well, we really don't have a date right now, and the reason for that is obviously we've broken it into multiple pieces. That east corridor section, if you will, from Adams to Mountain View is the piece that's nearing advertisement. The western piece obviously still depends on the discussions with ITD, and those are still pending. We've been working on getting the rest of it out. So when that will go in yet, I do not know. It's possible that we could look at a phased approach that would have a western terminus somewhere around the Adams Street intersection, or possibly just east of there, pending what happens with the western half. The western portion likely is not going to be constructed this year. It just doesn't seem likely that we'll get through the ITD process, design, out to bid, and then actually constructed. So we're probably looking at a spring timeline on that as well. So that's a part I have not delved into too far yet in terms of how that could have a phased terminus point somewhere up the hill versus fitting in with the rest of the system that's on the street today. The other question that comes in is with the change of course here of going from a vehicular bridge and the traffic that generates on the corridor to now a pedestrian bridge as an interim measure, and the traffic then not essentially changing, how much of those improvements are still necessary today. Things like some of the raised pedestrian crosswalks, other than the Adams Street, that were intended to do traffic calming due to increased traffic with the vehicular bridge isn't going to be there now, so maybe you don't need to do those. And so we've been looking at perhaps scaling those back in a phased approach as well, do all the sidewalks, do the speed limits, do all the lighting, all those kind of things. But some of the traffic calming features that were intended to address those impacts would be deferred until the vehicular bridge, multimodal bridge, was constructed at some later date.
So do you think the full $250,000 from the childhood pedestrian grant would be utilized?
Oh,
if
yes.
Those other
yes.
features
We will
weren't
make sure
put in?
that is done. We would construct, some of the curb bulbs on the side streets, we do all the sidewalk work. We've talked about the hawk signal at Mountain View, that would be part of it, the lighting on the speed zone signs, those types of things would all occur, and along with the Adams Street raised pedestrian crossing. So we're making sure that we more than adequately address that grant, meet the timeline, and expend those funds and city funds to go with it, so that we're, make sure that we are true to the project that with granting funds.
So,
Pardon me.
No.
If we take out some of the traffic calming things that were intended to slow down the vehicular traffic from the multimodal project, if we had funds in excess of what we would be doing there, could those be applied to the pedestrian bridge?
Well, potentially, but keeping in mind that we're not sure yet what this western piece is going to look like. So I'm trying to watch that budget pretty carefully and see what kind of bids we get on this eastern portion. And then whenever we sort out what exactly the western portion is going to be, we can then get those estimates finalized for what that's going to cost and see where we stand.
Yeah, I understand. We
Yeah.
don't know all the
We don't
exact
know yet,
numbers yet,
but- right.
but that structure could be within the guidelines of that grant. That's what I'm after.
Oh,
is
the
like
bridge itself?
The bridge itself or the approaches, or is there certain pieces of that could be, that grant money could be used to do the bridge?
Yeah, I don't know, because you get a little bit out of that. It becomes a little more of a hybrid between pedestrians and bikes, and that grant is pedestrian safety, not bicycle facilities. That's something we would have to look at, but I think we won't need to worry about that issue. I think there's sufficient pedestrian systems in what we're doing now to address the 250 grant just fine. The rest would be city dollars after that.
If I could, I think we've identified the pedestrian-related projects for that grant. As I think I'm going to probably reiterate what Les just said, but that's been identified fairly well, and that's really the focus with the pedestrian bridge going in, is to make sure those pedestrian improvements are there. So I think that makes good sense there. I don't know if we could switch the project at this point with the granting agency to move towards the bridge more. I think just maintaining those pedestrian improvements as previously intended is probably would be within the limitations of the grant. Changing it, I don't think we'd be allowed to do that.
But some of the raised crosswalks that we would no longer need, those were part of the grant.
Outside of the grant.
Oh, they were outside of the
If
grant.
there were items that were outside of the grant that were
Well,
coming
the-
from other funding, that would be, I think, what Les was saying, he could take a look at to see if they could be reallocated.
Yeah, the raised pedestrian crossings were included in the overall general scope of the grant application, along with a fair
That
amount of
was
city
my
money,
recollection,
right?
is that was all part of the same.
Yeah, it was
grant
all,
piece.
it was all packaged. Even removing those two raised pedestrian crossings at this point and doing the eastern portion, Adams to Mountain View, we can easily address the $250,000 grant, and then there will be additional city funds on top of that to make those improvements. But that then leaves the remaining city funds to do the western portion of the job, which again, we have not yet finalized scoping and costs. So I think within the funding that we've identified, we will likely utilize all of that for the improvements that are slated for the corridor. The question that complicates it a little bit further is when would we go back out for the multimodal bridge?
That's
As
where I
well.
want to start, because
And-
originally when you talked about this, we were talking about that we could move this bridge. So.
The the
Yeah, so-
pedestrian bridge, and it's one that we're making sure it's designed
That
such that
kind
it could
to
be
do, yeah.
relocated at another date. The second motion of the council last week was to rebid the multimodal bridge, but there was no timeline attached to that. And there's a big funding issue, obviously, attached to that as well, which we discussed a little bit at the meeting. So I think that's something that, the city supervisor will be looking for a little further guidance for Public Works as well, in terms of what that schedule ultimately should be. With the thought that if we are deferring traffic calming measures until that multimodal bridge goes in, if that is still going to be in 2019, then those monies would be needed in 2019 that we're currently putting aside. If it's a 2020 project, then it gives us a few more options and a little more time to work on budget considerations. So at this point, I guess my recommendation would be, let us keep going with the pedestrian bridge, but also keep going with the corridor to the east, minus those few items that would be the raised pedestrian crossings that would have a cost associated with that corridor improvement. And then as we look at the west end further, we'll have a better idea how we sit financially in the budget. And we can come back and report that at another meeting. If that makes
The
sense.
problems at the western end have to do with IDT's control of Washington Street?
Yes.
Is that the deal? So we could have the two-way bike lane all the way to Washington Street, just not across to the other side.
We would probably not advise bringing the two-way bike lane to Washington if it's not going to continue beyond that point. So bringing it to Jefferson, certainly, and that was an option we talked about. And then if ITD approves, go all the way up to Second Street. But if they don't, terminating that two-way bike lane at the Washington Street intersection, we think is problematic.
They put too many bikers there, not
But it's
sure.
in the turn lane, you'd have to be in the turn lane, and then when the light changed, you could go over and get on the bike lane from there, and you have the same issue the next block up, except you don't have a turn lane.
No.
So access to the two-way bike lane seems like more awkward without a turn lane than it does with the turn lane at Washington, to me. I mean, when we were looking at this before, and I would ride my bike up there and I'd try to imagine getting on that there, it seemed quite reasonable to get in the turn lane. When you have the light, then if you were just the same as if you were turning left, you would turn left and get on the, and once you're across the street, you're in the lane.
If you're going eastbound, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Coming westbound, then you just go straight. It's not a, if you're continuing on
Well,
Third.
and I believe part of the concern was that if this facility is intended to address those users that are not as comfortable, putting them into Third Street west of Washington is going to be problematic, because now they're in traffic, with
Yeah,
the
but there's
larger
pretty good
vehicles.
space. I mean, there's pretty good space between cars and the door zone there to ride. At least seems like there's plenty of space.
Well, I think just remembering with the subcommittee, they were concerned about with the newer users, that it needed to be crystal clear of how they were going to then either get to Main Street or get through that congested area, getting through Main Street and down. So that's why they were trying to roll them over to Second.
Rather than dropping them into the lane on the highway going westbound. I think that they were very concerned about that option.
It seems,
Yeah, we spent a lot of time on actually.
going straight's
both
always
those
better
areas.
than having to weave around. So, I mean, there's more problems can occur from multiple turns than a straight line.
Well, and for more comfortable riders, for you and I and others here, I don't think that'd be a problem. But for those that are not that comfortable, I think that would be a challenge. That's what the subcommittee believed.
And that's the same kind of idea that we ended up with over on the east side, trying to figure out the best way to get people crossing Mountain View. There was a lot, same amount of discussion on both ends once you get the corridor in place, but then how do you get them off to those other biking spaces, Mountain View and then Main Street or wherever they're going to go.
Yeah.
The corridor actually was easy once that decision was made compared to the ends.
The terminus points are the
Yeah,
challenge.
that's the
yeah,
ones,
that's
those are
true.
the hard ones.
Do you have any idea when you might hear back from ITD? Like-
We have not yet made application to ITD because it's a fairly extensive package to put together, and we've been concentrating on getting the rest of it out the door, mainly so that we can meet the timeline of the grant because that's the one that's really critical for us right now, is to make sure we get that constructed this season. And so that's been the focus, and with the staffing load being what it is right now, we can only stack up so many jobs at one time.
Did you
And
get
so
to
fitting it
ask
in.
them about mobilization fees, the two companies that put the bids together?
That, we're still delving into that one, so
Good gravies.
different, they're all different.
Oh, with the raised crosswalks, I mean, how was it, I'm thinking about these other side street bulb outs that are part of the whole package. So if some parts are going to go, are we sure that it should be the raised crosswalks and not some of those side street bulb outs?
Well, again, the main reason really for those raised crosswalks in the corridor was to deal with traffic mitigation related to the multimodal bridge. And
But because we're still wanting to do the multimodal, we still have to have that in place. I don't think we can take them out yet.
What are you talking about?
Well,
well, at this point, we would take them out with the idea that when the multimodal bridge occurs, then we would look at installation of traffic calming features beyond what the two-way bike lane and the narrower street lanes provides. Because honestly, there's not really a traffic issue today other than at the high school.
So then the side street curb bulb outs were not really in response to anticipating a multimodal bridge? That was just kind of a separate?
They were more of the
Job.
pedestrian safety
Okay.
aspect and walking the length of the corridor rather than
Okay.
the crossings.
Not slowing vehicles.
Correct.
And with the timing where you talked about, I guess we'll talk about that with the full council, right? But so it looks like it could go in the very good job. I'm sure it was a challenge to make up this schedule on such a tight schedule, but all the way through that mid-November step. Maybe it's just the December and January ones that perhaps if there were an extension, but everything else could go follow this timeline perhaps, because it has nothing to do with weather.
A lot of it could. The actual fabrication, if we change our target ending date from December, January to spring, just to be generic, the actual fabrication date, time where they fabricate the bridge might change a bit because they don't want these sitting around. Once they get done fabricating, they want to deliver them, typically, because they take up space in their yard. But that would give the contractor a little more flexibility on the fabrication side, fitting into their schedule, which maybe gives us a little better pricing, perhaps. But yeah, the other stuff, obviously the permitting, getting the bridge ordered, going through all the shop drawings, those kind of things to make sure it's going to meet the needs, sorting out the foundations, possibly installing the foundations depending on what style they are, and getting that the soil under the foundations prepared could happen before the weather turns. So yeah, I think the intent would be to do as much as we possibly can this fall, but just recognize that maybe our ending date is in the spring and actual delivery is a spring date, and then we do the final approaches and the decking, and then we're done, type thing.
And is the section of Third Street from Blaine to Mountain View? I recall that it was going to have to be wide, like the sidewalk was going to have to be moved.
Yes.
And so is that going to be happening imminently? Like
That is part of that eastern corridor work, would be that all of the sidewalk construction would occur, which would include those relocations or replacement of the sidewalk that was up against the curb. So those areas would all be part of this package that's just about to go out to bid.
Okay. One thing I wonder a little bit about where you were saying, since we're not doing don't have the need for the traffic calming with those raised crosswalks, that last stretch from Blaine to Mountain View, I'm wondering, and maybe it's a discussion for transportation or the subcommittee or the full council, if, as long as we have a bicycle and pedestrian only bridge, maybe the two-way protected bike lane could stop there, and then we retain that parking in that last section if there's no vehicles.
And just take the street.
I don't see a problem with it terminating at that point.
That would be a possibility as well. The actual two-way bike lane installation itself is not,
Hard.
it's not that
Right,
difficult. It's
yeah.
it's paint and vertical markers, and curb stops.
So there's nothing that would happen now that would mean that's no longer an option? I mean, we wouldn't be doing something now to prepare for the two-way bike lane to be in that section if it turns out we really.
We'd have to take a look to see. I have not looked at it from that perspective yet of some terminus point east of, or where it would terminate essentially at Blaine going eastbound. So we could look at that and see how that could work. So far, we've just been proceeding down the path of a continuous system, which is the direction we've received previously from the council.
So did you need us to give guidance about the multimodal piece, or what we were thinking, or ask questions?
Well, I think
Nothing?
ultimately that would be helpful when we, if you want to take it to the full council for discussion, that would be certainly, I think, reasonable. At this point, the primary focus is the pedestrian bridge schedule and acquisition dates to make sure that what we're doing is still consistent with what the council desires, and if there's any potential for modification of those initial dates. And then you have further clarification on what the council is thinking with respect to when to rebid the multimodal bridge would be helpful.
In the calendar, can you, I think it makes more sense not to do the work in the winter with what the staff has to do in the winter.
Sure.
Because of the fabrication piece, we have to give a definite answer, though, don't we?
Well, it's something we would talk to our vendor about. Would they have room to store it versus delivery upon completion of fabrication? And so that's something we'd need to talk to them about. Vendors vary in what size yards they have and if they have space for something to sit for a
Okay.
period of time.
Okay.
I think if there is a willingness on the part of the council to work with a spring completion date, I think that does give us more flexibility.
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah, I'm willing to work with logistics on when the installation is, because if we did place it in late November, it's probably going to get precious little use before March anyway. So I'm willing to be somewhat flexible on that. In terms of the rebid of the multimodal relative to that, I want that timeline preserved. We decided when we voted on we're going to rebid the bridge, it was with the assumption that the bridge was the pedestrian bike bridge was already in place before the rebid. So if we could preserve that timeline, I would be more comfortable with that. And I think there's precious little chance that we're going to get a bid that's within the initially budgeted funds this close to the recent bids. If we do it in February or something, I think there's precious little chance it's going to be $580,000 versus $900 and $1 million or whatever it is.
Whatever it was, right.
So postponing that doesn't make me uncomfortable at all. In fact, if we have the pedestrian bike bridge in place for a while and have some data about usage and all that kind of thing, maybe that helps us going forward with the multimodal bridge in terms of if we were going to make any design changes or what we're going to do.
Well, and if the council does decide to, postpone it a year or something like that, it does provide, further opportunity to, accumulate additional funds to address, shortfalls that we may have if that's the will of the council. Through the
Yeah,
budget
maybe some of the
process.
foam comes off the construction.
It may, right. And again, keeping in mind, we're bidding a project in July, which is about the worst time to do it. So we would hope to see better pricing when you bid it, late fall, early spring. But obviously, there's likely to be a gap in there between the budgeted amount and what we may see on even a lower bid. So that would give
Tried
us
that
time
with
to
the
address
downtown restroom, and how'd that work out?
Yeah.
Maybe not as well as we'd hoped.
So you're saying you want to hold the rebidding process until this other bridge is in place?
Yeah, that was the original sequence of things, how we decided the other night. If people want to talk about that, I'm open to discussion about it, but I would like to preserve that timeline just because that's what we unanimously decided to do, so.
And in some regards, the two motions were a little bit detached from each other, in that the one said, here's a schedule, put something in as a temporary structure, and then the second motion was go ahead and rebid, which could very well have been rebid in January, and if the numbers were what they needed to be, suddenly we're constructing in the spring a vehicular multimodal bridge, right? Again, that's,
what's
we
the problem with it?
just need to make sure we have clarification of what the council desires so that we're on the right track.
So,
So,
with everything being up in the air, it looks like at council, we're going to discuss this timeline and decide whether or not we give the flexibility in the spring. Is that what you heard?
Right.
Okay.
And we may have more concrete information about not to be a pun there, but we may have more information about what the cost and dimensions of the temporary bridge are by the time the council. I mean, the quotes that I got, obviously, there's flexibility in width of the bridge, length of the bridge,
All that.
decking.
yeah, load capacity, all those things.
Yeah, a lot of things.
Right.
Anything that I looked at had plenty of load capacity to be plowed and snow load and all that, and I put that in my request for quotes, that it had to be able to hold snow and it had to be, So, but you probably have more information and probably have talked to more manufacturers than I did. So,
Possibly by now, yes. Right.
I talked to Kyle Steele about the Corps of Engineers permitting, and as long as we're above the high water mark, we don't need a permit.
Right.
So.
And that's
we're
where the
going
length-
pavement to pavement, and we're
Well,
putting in some sort of a footing to bolt it to. That shouldn't be a concern. The permitting shouldn't be an issue at all.
Well, and again, you're correct, as long as our foundation work is outside of the channel, so we're above that ordinary high water mark on the channels and outside the slopes. But what that does is it dictates a length of structure, so making
Has to
sure
be
we're
more
far
than
enough-
49 feet, because that's how
That's
far
where
it
we
is
got
pavement
from
to pavement.
pavement to pavement, and so, by the time you figure the size of the foundations, you get far enough back with excavation that you're not getting into those banks, that starts lengthening that structure, which then brings the pricing up. So that's the balance
Yeah,
we're
I
trying to
assumed it would have to
work
be
our way
60
through.
feet in order
That's
to get
generally what we're looking at.
pavement to
right.
pavement where it didn't require any excavation of the channel.
And there will, of the channel itself, there will still need to be excavation under the foundation, because the material that's out there, the existing soils, are not great load-bearing soils. And so if it's, based on what our geotech tells us, if it's similar to what we did on College Street, there will be an excavation down 6-8 feet, backfill with a structural material, and then foundations constructed above that. And then we'll fit all that together, see where the deck ends up in relation to the roads, and how we then have to do the ramping, because it has to be ADA accessible, and all the rest. So, yeah, there's a lot of detail to work out, but it's doable.
Okay, so that conversation, and then I'm trying to understand exactly what you ask about in terms of, are we trying to bring an idea forward to council that says that we rebid the multimodal in 2020, that we kind of hold on that? Do we do it this coming January, the next January?
That's the question, is there a desired timeline? Because the motion just said rebid.
Yeah.
It didn't specify within a year, this spring, within 5 years, it didn't say.
Right.
So we're just really looking for clarification in that
And
regard.
as I'm sure Les will bring forward the information that he was hoping to have by this week, that'll come together for the current research that he's doing on the pedestrian and bike bridge, being able to bring that update on the schedule and getting that clarification, I'm certain will come to the full council, probably through committee at some point as well.
So we don't have to make a recommendation?
No,
at
today, this is
point?
just a report for information today, to
Okay.
kind of keep you in the loop. So those
and gives you
questions
guys
will be
some-
asked specifically as we move forward in other committee meetings.
How we might be thinking in terms of being able to negotiate those time. I came up with those timelines based on, you got to start someplace with a
Sure.
concrete timeline.
Sure,
You can't
absolutely.
just say, well, someday we want
Someday,
to
yeah.
do something for some cost.
Right.
You had to narrow it down, and that's a basis for,
Yeah.
Right here.
for
Yeah.
approaching the problem, like.
Yeah, and I think the intent was perhaps to go to council on the 6th, just because right now we are working under those timelines. That was the motion approved by the council, and so until there's some other action.
Yeah, until
that's-
we make a
that's what we
motion
have.
to go ahead,
modify it.
proceed with this timeline and installation in March or
Something
some,
like that,
some
yeah.
other concrete
Right.
date that's logistically more practical, then that's where we are.
Okay.
So I think the intent was to try to do that on the 6th as well.
Yeah, and I think you had anticipated then having that information, you were
So that
still
we
waiting
could-
back, so you'd have the whole.
We'll have
package.
more information,
Yeah.
obviously, by then.
Oh, okay,
That makes
that's
sense,
good.
okay.
Well, thank you for the update very much, and look forward to seeing you at council. Yeah,
Okay,
very
very
good. And with it, there are no other items on our agenda, so we may close. Need a motion.
I move that we close, adjourn.
Thank you.
Aye.
Good.